Hello, it's me, Ariza Gaming, and today I want to talk about the Frosty Planet Pack DLC for Oxygen Not Included in general. So this DLC came out several months ago, and it features new planets, new biomes, critters, plants, new story trait, new buildings and technologies, lots of little features that are quite interesting, and provide a pretty deep and complex gameplay experience overall. It's not quite as large as the Spaced Out DLC that came out a few years ago, but there's a lot of complexity packed into a relatively small package, and I just wanted to talk about my favorite elements from this DLC and how I feel they could be improved in future, and just comparing it to the Bionic Booster Pack DLC that came out as well a few weeks ago. So, first of all, let's talk about the main feature of the DLC, the new planets and biomes. So, on the Ceres asteroid, you'll start in a small area with snow, ice, wood, a big pile of wood next to you, and no rock, and no liquid water. It's way too cold for that. So immediately, you're having to think of new solutions to problems. How do you run an efficient bathroom when you can't run sinks with water or lavatories with water for showers or anything like that? Well, there's a new building in the game called the Ice Liquefier, which you can use to melt snow into ice. But you need wood for a lot of these things. There's wood heaters that your duplicates can use to heat up. When this DLC came out, they also updated the game so that chilly surroundings and toasty surroundings significantly debuffed your duplicates, so now you've got to manage the temperature a bit more thoroughly as well to avoid big athletics penalty. And you start off in this really alien situation with completely new critters, temperatures below minus 30 degrees, none of your usual building materials, and it's a really fresh start to the game, which I really appreciate. If you've played a lot of the base game and a lot of Spaced Out, you will definitely appreciate having a new challenge to solve with the Frosty Planet Pack biomes. There's three main biomes in the game. There's the new Phlox biome, which has the cinnabar ore clusters, lots of ice and dirt. That's where you start. There's also the Mammoth Zone. I'll talk more about the critters later. And the Mammoth Zone is where you find your iron ore, so that's where your metal actually is. That's where the rock is as well, igneous rock. And you also find these big sucrose deposits, which you may be wondering what on earth that's going to be used for. So you want to go find one of those to get your metal stocks up and running. And then at the top of the map, you'll find the nectar biomes, where you have spigot seals and nectar trees. But importantly, it's also full of a new material, mercury. And mercury is very interesting because it's a metal that's liquid at room temperature. It's liquid down to about minus 40 degrees C. But the nectar biome, where it spawns, is at about minus 60 degrees C. So if you can get your duplicates in there, you've got a lot of refined metal that you have access to. But you can't really use it for building stuff unless you manage to keep it cold and keep your base cold, which is an interesting challenge. Do you keep your base cold so you can use it for building, or do you heat everything up and then it just becomes some kind of nuisance metallic liquid that you can't really use very efficiently? I think it adds a really interesting dynamic to the game, and it's also quite interesting to me that it's not a renewable resource. I think a lot of people expected it to be renewable through some kind of geyser or something, but I kind of like that it's not, because it becomes less of a resource and more of a challenge to overcome. Like, how do you actually excavate and navigate this area where the metal can melt at any point? And it's still an interesting material for you to use because compared to other non-metallic liquids, it has a very high thermal conductivity. You can use it as a heat exchanger, a heat exchange medium for your builds. I always like when they add new materials to the game because it's a very interesting way for you to, like, it's very interesting to think about how that might change your industrial processes and, like, how you're organizing stuff. It's always nice adding new elements like that. So nectar is another material that got added as part of this DLC, and I think this is a really useful material to have in the game. So it's a reward for actually looking after the bonbon trees and getting them growing properly. And it's a liquid that has really high heat capacity, but also a really low freezing point and a relatively high boiling point of about 160 degrees. And it freezes at like minus 82.5 degrees. So this is a really good liquid for you to use in thermal aqua tuners, and it makes them a bit more accessible for people who are trying to figure out heating and cooling, and well, particularly base cooling. Like, how do you keep certain parts cool? I know that's a challenge that a lot of new players have, and I like that they've added this resource to the game that really incentivizes using this the thermal aqua tuner and just learning more about these mechanics. And of course, you can turn it directly into plastic with the polymer press, which is very useful as well, because you might not be in a situation where you have oil. It just gives you another option compared to the Mammoths if you don't necessarily want to, or the Drecos if you don't want to go down the glossy Dreco route, or you don't have access to oil wells. It's always nice when there's multiple options in the game, because then problem solving becomes about how do I most efficiently solve this problem, rather than how do I do the one path to get me to the finish line. And yeah, I really like these new biomes. It really gets you thinking about different ways of solving problems. And it makes it really feel like its own unique experience that's worth paying for in a DLC. And I also really like that you could shuffle these new biomes into existing world types. So you don't have to generate it on a frosty planet. You can generate frosty biomes on a regular asteroid, or any type of asteroid that you want. And the game also accounts for the spaced out DLC pretty well, in that you can generate a Ceres moonlet cluster. They added that as a feature after the DLC had been out for a while. So you can go around and explore all these tiny little moonlets with lots of cold biomes and barely any useful resources, and it's a really interesting challenge. I know I struggled a lot with actually getting it to work at first. Like, how on earth do we get power going in an environment with no seemingly easy power sources? So, the next thing I want to talk about are the critters and the plants that you can find in the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. And I really appreciate how this DLC has handled things for two reasons. First of all, these critters all like cold environments, or can tolerate cold environments, or their food requires cold environment. So it gives you more of a reason to try and actually make life thrive in colder places. Again, encouraging slightly different base design principles, and just adding life to areas of the map where it would have felt a bit cold and sterile before. It's nice that we've got different options for different environments now for producing different materials. Like, if you want wood normally, you might go for arbor trees or oak shells, both of which want a warm environment. But now with the phloxes, you can feed them pike apples or bristle blossoms, and they produce a large amount of wood from their shearable antlers. And they are happy at relatively cold temperatures. So it just gives you more options, and I really like it. And I also really like how the critters both loop into the original game content and into each other. So there's a very potent loop in the game with phloxes and mammoths, where the phloxes eat plants, eat the pike apples, a new food plant that grows from phosphorite. You get the wood from the phlox antlers, and then you turn that wood into ethanol via ethanol distillers, and you feed that ethanol to nosh sprouts or the new plume squashes, which is another plant in this Frosty Planet Pack DLC. And then the mammoths will eat those plants, and then they'll produce the mammoth patties, which you can crush at the rock crusher into clay and phosphorite. So, and then you can feed the phosphorite back to the pike apples. And it's a loop that you can get going. And once you've managed to get all of the elements working properly, you can get a lot of free resources out of it. So the game really rewards you for actually investing the time and effort into getting to know this new content. And what I really liked as well is with the update they did after this DLC came out, they added the extra food options for these critters. Like, they let phloxes eat bristle blossoms, they let mammoths eat nosh sprouts. So now this stuff ties back into the base game as well. If you've shuffled your biomes and you're playing a relatively normal asteroid, but you find a frozen biome full of phloxes, you can take advantage of that if you're already growing bristle blossoms in your base, because that's the food that you started within the Terra biome. So you can link up with the new Frosty Planet Pack DLC really easily, and the result is you just have a lot more options at any given point in the game when you're mixing in that content. And I think it adds a lot of replayability as a result. You don't just have to go for the tried and tested solution that you always knew. You can play around with these new guys and find new things to do. Like, I still don't really understand fully what to do with the spigot seals. Like, obviously they take the nectar from the bonbon trees and they produce ethanol. But you could also melt when the spigot seals expire, you could take the tallow and use it for cooking, or you could melt it into crude oil directly, and then you've got crude oil for your duplicates. And obviously the fact that they produce cold ethanol in a cold environment is also very beneficial, because if you're feeding that cold ethanol to plants, you don't have to worry about keeping the plants cold so much, because they're getting a cold food source. But then there's also the pros and cons, like how are you getting the light for the trees? How are you actually supplying them with the snow? I presume you're harvesting meteors, or you're using the new capabilities of the ice maker to make snow. But it adds a lot of interesting wrinkles, and these problems aren't fully solved, and I'm not sure there is always the best way to solve problems with these new critters. You always have a few different options because of how they've designed them, which I really, really appreciate. And the spigot seals are very cute as well, so I like that a lot. And another thing I like that's quite underrated, I think, is the alveoveras. So these are the new oxygen plant that you find in your starting biome, and they're like oxyferns, but balanced around the fact that you can get as many of them as you want. So you need to feed them ice, which is a bit challenging. You either need to cool down the water somehow in an automated system, or use the ice maker to make more. You do find a lot of ice to start with on these planets, so it's not a huge issue. But if you're trying to get them to work on a normal asteroid, it's an interesting problem to think about. But they produce the oxalite directly. So if you're in a case where you don't have, say, puffs for dense puffs, or you don't have a gold volcano for the oxalite refinery, it lets you get oxalite for your rockets. But you have to balance that against the fact that A, you need the ice, and B, they need a lot of carbon dioxide. They need more carbon dioxide than your duplicants breathe out, compared to the oxyfern. So it adds, that plant in particular adds some interesting wrinkles to base design. Do you generate a load of extra CO2 and feed it to the alveoveras to get stuff going, or is that going to cause a problem further down the line? The pros and cons of these new critters and plants occur at different stages in your playthrough. Like, some things might be very useful early on, like the alveoveras, and then you're thinking, how on earth do I scale them up to a larger base later on? Or, like, say you're using the mammoths to start with because you've got lots of pools of ethanol on the map in your mammoth biomes, because there's a few of them in there. You might start feeding a load of plume squashes or nosh sprouts the ethanol, and then you actually run out of the ethanol, and you're like, okay, well, now how do I generate my ethanol? Do I generate cold ethanol with spigot seals, or hot ethanol with wood sources and ethanol distiller? And there's just lots of interconnectedness, and I really enjoyed it. I think they've done a really good job with both the plants and the critters. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is just doing a quick little breakdown of the new buildings they've added with some of the new technology updates in the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. I've alluded to a few of them already, I think, but the snow tile and the wood tile, I think they're really interesting. So, as I said, you don't start with access to any rock in the normal series starting biome. So having the option to build tiles out of snow is very nice. They're not as good as regular tiles because they don't give you the run speed bonus. And you also have to worry about the melting, so you've got to make sure you're not generating too much heat in your frosty base to start with, at the risk of your infrastructure melting, which I think is very funny. And the wood block, I think, is also nice as an alternative to tiles, and to metal and plastic tiles as well. It gives you the same run speed bonus as a normal tile, but it takes a lot of wood to make. So you have to have a large wood industry before you can build it, and the reward for that is it gives you a large amount of decor. Gives you plus 15 decor spread out over 3 tiles. So if you don't have your metal tiles from your refined metal volcanoes set up yet, or your metal refineries, it's a nice intermediate step that you can get with floxes fairly early on, or arbor trees or oak shells if you're doing it on a normal run. And it adds a lot of character to the game, I think. I really like the True Tiles mod, where you can see what material tiles are made out of, and it adds a lot more variety to aesthetics in the game. And I think wood tiles really contribute to that as well. So I'm really happy about that addition. There's also the wood block, which is a decorative building that takes up a 1x1 space. So you can fit it in all the gaps where you can't normally fit paintings or statues or whatever. But the cost is a lot of wood. It's more expensive than even the wood tiles. And the amount of decor it gives is all right, but it's not huge. So it's again a reward for getting your lumber industry up and running, and it just adds some more flexibility for decorating your base. I really like it. Very solid addition. We definitely needed something of this size. There's the Mercury ceiling light as well, which I think is really interesting. So this produces an absolute ton of light for very little power costs, at the caveat that it requires some mercury to be consumed to run it. Now, this is interesting because A, if you combine it with a solar panel, you actually generate more power than you put in. So that gives you an option for power generation in the cold map. But it's also interesting because the mercury is a finite resource. There's no mercury geyser in the game. So if you run out, you're going to have to go to space to get it, and you're not really going to get enough to run a lot of things. So it's more of a transitionary tool than something you really want to rely on. I'm thinking it's interesting because it makes you think about that in the game. Like, if you set up your spigot seal ranch with your bonbon trees, getting light from the mercury lamps because it's all in the same area, that makes a lot of sense. But what do you do when you run out of the mercury? You're going to have to get some other light source in there. Or do you want to save it for solar power instead because you don't want to generate a load of power via dirty petroleum generators consuming ethanol? You've got a little dichotomy there. It's quite interesting. I do find it odd that the building charges up to maximum light production with the full throughput of mercury, but if you put half the throughput of mercury in, it stays at whatever level it charged up to. It's quite a weird, counterintuitive mechanic, and it doesn't really feel like very intended behavior that you charge it up and then you let it just run at half throughput, and it's just twice as efficient for no extra cost. So I wouldn't be surprised if they tweak this a little bit in the future, but then they haven't tweaked stuff like the melting point of uranium, so they probably won't touch this. But I like it. I like that there's some more thinking about how you actually set it up as well with the pipes and valves and whatnot. We did a video about that a while ago. There's the wood heater as well, which lets you heat up your duplicants. So one thing I'm really glad that this DLC did, or the updates surrounding the DLC did in general, was giving people a reason to make space heaters. Because space heaters were absolutely awful at actually generating heat in terms of power efficiency. But they're very good now at specifically heating up duplicants, which is very important because if they're chilly, they get a big athletics penalty, and you might not necessarily have them all in suits or have heated up these cold areas, or you might not even want to heat them up. So the wood heater actually does this quite well, because it doesn't heat up the area very well, especially if it's in a carbon dioxide area. But the duplicates will go over to it and heat themselves up, and this allows you to have little hotspots in your cold base, so everyone can stay warm, but you can still keep stuff cold, keep your critters cold, keep your plants cold, possibly keep some mercury cold, who knows. But it's nice that that's an option in the game as well, because unlike the space heater, it doesn't consume power, it just consumes wood. And you start with a big tranche of wood. And then you've got the interesting case of how do you transition away from that? Do you just switch to powered means, or do you actually get wood supplies going with ranching or growing arbor trees, etc.? And then we've also got the ice liquefier. I'm really glad this building exists now. It just lets you put wood in, and it lets you melt ice quickly into water. It doesn't generate a ton of heat into the environment either. It just melts the ice. And it's actually very efficient at melting the ice, considering how relatively little material and duplicant time you're putting into it, and the heat capacity of the ice you're putting in. And then we've got the deep fryer at last, which uses the tallow that you get from the spigot seals to cook more advanced foods. Like, you can make squash fries from the plume squashes. You could get like tempura shellfish and things. It's a nice little addition to the game. I'm not sure overall how useful this is. I'm glad it's an option as well with the spigot seals, and the tallow helps you enhance other foods. I must say, given how much advanced food you can make from the tallow of spigot seals, it does seem like a very efficient way of stretching out calories. Because each spigot seal produces a fairly large amount of tallow when they die for cooking purposes. 50 kilograms isn't a lot if you're melting it into oil, but it is a lot if you're making a lot of food. So yeah, I also like the pemmican addition to the micro musher, where you put meat and tallow together, and it makes a fairly cheap and dirty space food that you could use for your rocket travel. It's another option compared to the berry sludge with the bristleberries and the sleet wheats. And again, I just like that it gives you more options. So instead of a plant-based non-perishable food, you now have a meat-based non-perishable food, so just critters, which I like. I think it adds some more balance to the game. So another little addition I wanted to talk about is the Luma quarters that you can find in the Mammoth biomes. I really like these. They're a little light source that you can get one of your decorator dupes to come and carve, and then you can move it around your base. It just generates a small fixed amount of light, doesn't generate any power, or doesn't consume any power, doesn't generate any heat. But it's just a little decoration you can move around, put on pedestals, that sort of thing, and it generates a little bit of light. So if you want to generate light in a room without generating residual heat from a lamp, like say you've got some bonbon trees and you're trying to light them up, and you don't want to get them too hot for them to produce their nectar, then that's an option. You can stack them around. You can put them in conveyor loaders and conveyor rails as well and move them around. And because they're a decorative item, you can stack them infinitely on top of each other in space and make a really strong light source if you pull them all together. But they are limited in quantity because you only find them naturally in the biomes as you dig up the biomes. So, finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about in this DLC is the new story trait, the Geothermal Heat Pump. And this is a very interesting and very, very powerful new story trait that you find on these series Frosty Asteroid. So you dig down towards the bottom of the map and you'll find this big heat pump. And what you need to do is fill it with liquids, and then those liquids get heated up and pumped to the vents around the map. There's 3 different vents in 3 different spots. And they'll output the liquids 150 degrees hotter than what you put them in. And it doesn't require any power or anything. It's just sort of baked into the map, like archaic technology. One of the vents is blocked, and you have to actually clear it by putting a liquid in there. You can heat up enough with the 150 degrees boost to melt the lead blockage, which I think is a really interesting sort of challenge for a story trait. And I like that it's also very just helpful in actually getting things up and running. It's very strong, and one theme of the Frosty Planet areas is that you kind of struggle to find a convenient power source. You can do ethanol-related power, but then you're chucking out a ton of carbon dioxide and polluted dirt from the ethanol distillers and the petroleum generators. Or you could go for the solar power with the mercury lamps, but then you're using all the mercury, you're going to run out of that. Or you could do some other grid-based shenanigans. But the geovent, if you pump water into it, if you pump hot water into it, it's going to turn into hot steam. And the best part is you can take that steam and feed it back into steam turbines and get the hot water back out. So you can actually set this up on a completely closed loop. Up to 30 kilograms per second of liquid can go into it because it has 3 different input ports. And it's just, if you hook that up, we did this on our Blasted series run, it's an absurd amount of steam power. And it barely uses up any materials. A small fraction of the water or whatever liquids you put into it is turned into impurities. But it's like 5%-ish of the amount of liquid you put in. So if you've got like a single water source from somewhere else, you can just plug it in and you just get free endless power. It's just so much power. And the impurities are really interesting because the hotter the liquid you pump into the heat pump, the more impurities you get and the more different types of materials you get. And these could be a wide range of materials in the game, like non-renewable materials as well. Like you can get granite out of it, you can get rust, you can get sour gas, you can get wolframite, and if you get it really hot, you can even get space materials like fullerene and niobium out of it. Once you get it past a certain temperature, it actually sucks the heat out to make the space materials, which I find pretty interesting. So that's a very interesting late game challenge, trying to figure out how to keep your liquids hot enough pumping through that to get you more space materials. And it provides an alternative to the spaced out DLC for getting these. You can get them on your starting asteroid, provided you get your industry to the point where you can make those super hot liquids reliably. Which I really appreciate as being an option in the game. But I do have a criticism about this. I think using it for steam power is way easier and, to be honest, way better. Like, it's so easy to just catapult your run into the late game with the steam power from this thing. I don't know why you would bother actually pumping in the hotter liquids and trying to get it to work producing these impurities for you. I feel like the risk-reward ratio on the steam power is a little bit too low. Like, it's not very complex to operate once you've just started pumping water in. You have to pump in something a little bit hotter to clear the blockage, but even then, you can still pump the water into 2 of the 3 vents and get 20 kilograms per second of water cycling through it without much effort, other than just having the steam turbines set up. I feel like they need to add like a little bit of complexity to make it sort of just not just the default choice every time you're playing on the Series Moon. It's just rush for the heat pump so you can get your free power. I'm not sure exactly how you would do that, but let me know in the comments how you would sort of add an interesting caveat to the heat pump to balance that aspect out. Or maybe they should just make it a bit more rewarding to go for the higher level impurities as well. Yeah, I also like that some of the duplicates are frostproof, so you don't have to worry about the chilly surroundings with them necessarily. Are they going to add a heat-resistant duplicate to the game that isn't going to get the toasty surroundings debuffed, or would it be too overpowered if they couldn't get scalded either? I suppose that's probably the answer. But yeah, interesting addition traits-wise. It's nice that you start by default with a frost-resistant duplicate unless you re-roll them. Freya is definitely very useful when you're learning about the new mechanics with this DLC. So I appreciate that a lot. So yeah, those are overall my thoughts on the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. I think this DLC does a really good job of providing a cohesive package of stuff that expands the game, but doesn't feel like it's mandatory to get until like you've learned a bit more about the base game. Like you don't have to get this to have the complete experience of the game. It's just a nice little extra add-on, but it integrates really well into the base game and the spaced out content and systems in sort of multi-layered ways. It's not surface level stuff. The new critters interact with the old critters and the new plants and the old plants, and it's all connected. You could shuffle the new frosty biomes into the original planets, into the different spaced out layouts, and there's just a lot of new opportunities created for fun gameplay, and I think it's really good value considering how cheap the DLC is and how much replayable content there is in the game. And the heat pump is great fun, either just for blitzing through the early power or trying to figure out how to get all the advanced materials from it. I think there's a lot of depth in that story trait, and I think it could use a little bit of balancing, but it's really what I want to see from story traits in this game going forward. So I just want to quickly touch on the Bionic Booster Pack DLC that Clay recently released a couple of weeks ago. And I like that DLC a lot, but I think it could really use something to tie it all together in a more cohesive package like the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. I think they should have added a synthetic planet type or synthetic biomes to the world generation in that DLC. I think it would be an interesting way to sort of frame a lot of the advantages and disadvantages of the Bionic duplicates. Like, you could have an environment where there's very little naturally occurring water, but there's like oil fissures and gas vents, and you've got to figure out how to use the bionic duplicates and perhaps the gunk and petroleum generators and that sort of thing to actually get water together so you can actually get oxygen. Maybe have it lead a bit more on the rust deoxidizers as well, a pretty underrated building, but maybe that's one of like the key pathways in this game. Maybe you have some critters or like some sort of synthetic critters that interact with rust and metals specifically. I really like that the Regal Mammoths add an option for renewable metal ore in the Frosty Planet Pack DLC now. Maybe they'd add a critter that gives you renewable abyssalite access or some other refined metal access and recycling that you wouldn't normally do with critters. I think there's a lot of options they could have for sort of tying together the different elements they added for the Bionic duplicates in that DLC, and I think they could look back at the Frosty Planet Pack as a pretty good blueprint of how to improve the Bionic Booster Pack content, because I know they're going to do some more patches to add more stuff to that pack, like they did with the Frosty Planet Pack DLC, and that update to the Frosty Planet Pack DLC really helped flesh it out. So I'm really looking forward to see what they do with the Bionic Booster Pack stuff, and I hope they lead a little bit more on the approach they took with the Frosty Planet Pack for that. But I'll talk more about that in another video. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. It's been out for a few months now. I feel like I've fully gained understanding in all of the new mechanics, and unlike Spaced Out, I feel like it's actually fairly achievable to just do everything in this DLC without sinking hundreds of hours into it, which I really like. I really like that. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on the Frosty Planet Pack DLC. What did you like? What didn't you like? What would you like to see Clay do going forward? What would you like them to leave behind or fix or change in some other ways? So yeah, as usual, I'll be on Twitch. We're currently doing Bionic Booster Pack on the series Moonlets cluster, so it's still interacting a lot with the Frosty Planet Pack DLC content there, and the new Bionic Booster Pack content as well. So you can see it all on the Twitch streams on weekday evenings. And yeah, there's a Discord where we're all discussing stuff as well and sharing our builds and having lots of fun. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you there. And yeah, I'll be back shortly with a review for the Bionic Booster Pack DLC. So take care, everyone. I'll let Whiskers take us away. Bye for now.
Whiskers sends thanks to the following Twitch subscribers and YouTube members: 999999999, Cakeface1212, FRD. Grey Area, Ion Elgis, Sweet Danger Kitty, and Uglavisk.